Hi everyone, welcome back. So we are continuing on with chapter 10, evolution and its process. So in the previous video we learned about how populations change with natural selection being the mechanism that drives that population change. So we're going to learn about other mechanisms including natural selection, but there's other ones that are involved. So we're going to dive into 10.2 mechanisms of evolution. So by the end of this video you should be able to describe the 4 basic causes of evolution. So we already talked a little bit about natural selection in the last video, so we'll get into a little bit more detail on that, as well as mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow as these 4 basic causes of evolution. And so those are the mechanisms. And then we will also explain how each evolutionary force can influence the allele frequencies of a population. So we're continuing to kind of focus in on that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, but using that idea of allele frequencies and seeing how they change over time. So here are the 4 factors that always affect populations. Okay, so remember with the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we'd have to assume that these are constant, that these don't exist basically for it to apply. But these do exist in populations. They always affect populations. So we're going to go through each one of these mechanisms and see how they affect the populations and how they cause them populations to change. So we're going to start with natural selection, and then we'll get into mutation and genetic drift and gene flow. So if you didn't write them down, that's okay. We'll go through each one individually, starting with natural selection. So we already talked about natural selection in the last video. So recall that natural selection is where the individuals that have the best adaptations or best genetics for the current environment are going to survive the best, and they're going to therefore be able to pass on those traits to the next generation. Okay, so for example, you can see here, this is just a picture of some mice, and the ones that blend into the surroundings will probably survive longer than the ones that stick out. Okay, so the bird of prey here, the hawk, will pick off the ones that stick out, like the little white ones will stick out, making them easy targets for the hawk. And so over time you'll see less of the white mice because they'll die off before they are able to breed. And so the dark colored mice will survive longer, and so they'll pass on their dark coloration gene to the next generation. So over time we'll see less of the white mice, more of the dark coloration mice being born, and so the population as a whole will shift, right? So they'll shift more towards seeing, more darker colored mice in that population. Okay, so we'll see that shift occur. So the allele behind the phenotype that provides the best advantage will have the greater representation in the next generation. Now, with evolution, we never want to assume that there's ever going to be a perfect condition. Okay, so the mice that are currently in the black coloration, that might be the best adaptation for this current environmental condition, but that doesn't mean it's always going to be the best adaptation. Okay, so if the environment changes to maybe be like whiter color, then then suddenly the mice that are darker color may not have the best advantage. Okay, so evolution is it's only acting on what the environmental conditions are. Okay, so the environmental conditions are always changing, so there's no perfect organism out there. Conditions will always change. We humans, we are not perfect, right? So we will definitely, things we can improve upon ourselves as well. All right. So we're going to take a look at some types of natural selection or types of selection. There's 3 of them. This was not actually in your textbook, so I'm just going to briefly go over them just because it's something that I think might be in your objectives. And I think we talk about it in your lab, but I do want to mention it. So directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive, or sometimes you'll see it as diversifying selection. Okay, so the first one, directional selection. We've seen this example already in your textbook, but we didn't define it as a form of directional selection. So in directional selection, it favors the phenotypes at one end of the spectrum of existing variation. Okay, so for example, if we have the 2 different morphs for our moths, we have the dark colored morphs and then we have the pepper colored morphs. And we can see that, before the Industrial Revolution, we see that, within our spectrum here, actually let me get my pen out. Okay, so let's say that we have, the majority of the population are the pepper colored. Okay, so I'm gonna put over here, this is the pepper color. Okay, and then over here is the black color. Okay, the dark color, D. Okay, so in this original population, we can see that the average was around here in the original population, the OG. Okay, but then in the Industrial Revolution it hit, and then we have the smokestacks are spewing out all this soot, and it's covering the tree trunks, and so the tree trunks are killing off, that soot is killing off all the lichen, which the pepper moths were blending into the lichen perfectly, making it hard for the birds to spot them. And so now that the soot is covering the tree trunks, turning the tree trunks black, suddenly this the black color morph is blended in to the tree trunks, whereas the pepper colored morph is standing out. So now the black color morph is at a distinct advantage. Okay, so the black colored morph is less likely to get eaten by the birds. The pepper colored morph is more likely to get eaten by the birds. Okay, so maybe 20, 30 years later, we do a population check again, and we see that the majority of the moths are now dark color. Okay, so we see it shift. So now it's the population has shifted. So the average is now over here. So the new population has shifted. So we see that there's a lot more dark colored morphs compared to light colored morphs. Okay, there's very few of the light colored morphs. All right, so based on that, we see that it shifted in one direction. It shifted to which direction? It shifted to the right. It shifted towards the dark coloration. So it favored one end of the spectrum. It favored the dark colored morphs over the light color. So that's it. An example of directional selection. It favored the dark color over the light. So it shifted the population in one direction. We see fewer light colors, we see more dark colors. Okay, so that's an example of directional selection. Okay. The next type of selection we're going to talk about is stabilizing selection. So in stabilizing selection, instead of one morph being favored over the others, in this case the intermediate is favored over the extremes. Okay, so in this case we have the robin egg clutches. The intermediate amount of eggs is favored over the extreme amount of eggs. Okay, so it's better for robins to lay about 4 eggs, for example, than to lay, say, 8 eggs or 2 eggs. Okay, so if they lay 2 eggs, then they're going to end up with too small of a clutch. And if one of them dies, or if both of them die for whatever reason, then they're not going to be able to pass on their genes to the next generation. If they end up with 8 eggs, then they're going to end up with too many chicks to feed, and they're going to end up with malnourished chicks, which many of them might not survive anyway. Okay, so 4 seems to be the perfect number. So if they lay 4 eggs, then that's the perfect number for them to be able to care for. They have plenty of eggs that they can feed and care for, and enough that if they lose one, if one's not viable, or if one gets eaten by a predator, they still have 3 to be able to pass on their genes to the next generation. Okay, so this is an example of stabilizing selection. Okay, so too big of a clutch is not good. Too small of a clutch is not good, but an intermediate value is good. Okay, so the intermediate value is favored over the extremes. So this is different from directional selection, where one side or one is favored over the other. Okay, so this one is the middle is favored over the extremes. So it's stabilizing. Another example of stabilizing selection would be birth weight for us humans. Okay, so with us humans, everybody's right around about 7 pounds, somewhere around there. And that's because, really small babies, there's an issue of survivability once they're born if they are of a low birth weight. And then really, really big babies, past 10 pounds, there's a risk to mom. Okay, mom giving birth, especially in non-hospital settings, and without the assistance of healthcare professionals, she puts herself at risk. Okay, so that's why the average birth rate for human babies is right around the same. Okay, so most of us were around 6 to 8 pounds when we were born. Okay, and that's just due to stabilizing selection, because the extremes could kill mom or kill baby or kill both. Okay, so stabilizing selection. And then the last type of natural selection is disruptive, or sometimes you see it as diversifying selection. So diversifying or disruptive selection is the opposite of stabilizing selection. So in stabilizing selection, the intermediate is favored over the extremes. But in diversifying or disruptive, the extremes are favored over the intermediate. Okay, so here's an example. We have the morphs of different rabbit colorations here. We have the dark morph, we have the Himalayan morph, and then we have the white morph. And the white morph happens to be the intermediate morph. And in this case, the extremes tend to be favored over the intermediate. So the intermediate morph tends to stick out on the rocky environment. So that becomes, they're prey animals, and so they tend to be eaten up by the predators. Whereas the Himalayan morph and the gray morph tends to blend in better to the rocky environments. Okay, so we see over time that the population of the Himalayan morphs increases, the population of the gray coloration increases, and we see a dip in the white color rabbits. Okay, that morph decreases. Okay, so you see this weird curve shape form. So the intermediate value is declined. Okay. So another example of that would be in salmon. So especially with male salmon, when it's breeding season, when the male salmon are making their way and the female salmon are making their way up the streams in order to spawn. For salmon, for male salmon, it's either better to be big or small. So big salmon, they can defend a little territory where they can, be able to defend a little, area of the creek, and be able to, defend that territory and be able to spawn, with the females that are in that territory and defend that territory from other males getting in there. The smaller salmon, however, that are males, they're small enough that they can sneak in there undetected. Okay, so it's better to be small or big if you're male. But if you're medium size, you're too small to be able to defend a territory, but you're too big to go into the territory to go in unnoticed, and so you end up not being able to spawn or be able to spawn with other fish. So yeah, so you end up with this kind of same curve here. So the larger salmon males survive, and the smaller salmon males are able to breed, but the medium size are not able to breed. Okay. All right, so those are the different types of natural selection. So we talked about directional selection, where one morph is favored over the other, and so it shifts in one direction. Stabilizing selection, where the intermediate is favored over the extreme, so it kind of causes the curve to become more narrow. And then disruptive or diversifying, where the extremes are favored over the intermediate. So you get these two curves. Okay. All right, so our second mechanism of evolution is mutation. So recall that mutation is the ultimate source of new alleles in a population. So this is how we get, the change in the DNA sequence. So if we have a mutation occur in the DNA sequence, that can cause a new variation occur in a, in an allele. It forms a new allele. Okay. If it's a harmful mutation, it will eventually get removed because it'll be found at such a low frequency that those that if it becomes harmful, it's not going to, the individuals that have that mutation will not be able to survive long enough to be able to reproduce and pass on that mutation to the next generation. If it's a beneficial mutation, then it will, be a benefit. So the individuals that possess that mutation will be able to survive longer and reproduce more. So they'll pass it on to the next generation, and eventually it'll spread through the population from generation to generation, increasing in frequency. Okay. So it just kind of depends, whether this mutation, time will tell if it's going to be a beneficial or harmful mutation, or it could just have no effect whatsoever. Like, this one, it ended up having petals come out from the middle. So, time will tell whether that if that affects the way it gets pollinated, if it becomes a harmful mutation, or, maybe if it's beneficial in any way, or if it's a no effect mutation. Okay. The third mechanism of evolution is genetic drift. So with genetic drift, we're going to start out with an Amoeba Sisters video, and then we'll talk about it.
So here's a question for you. Have you ever compared the candy you get on Halloween with your friends? My sister and I, a bit competitive in the sport of Halloween candy hunting, we both had preferences of which kind of candy we hoped to get in our buckets each year. And as for me, I love gummy bears. And every once in a while, someone would have them mixed in a big bucket, and I remember watching with intense focus the hand that picked out the candy hoping for gummy bears. getting those gummy bears was always total luck, total chance. Well, unless of course the entire bucket they had was actually gummy bears, but that would not be luck. That would be pure bliss. But that's never happened to me yet. So why bring this up? Well, what if instead of candy we were talking about insects? And they weren't in a Halloween bucket because that'd be kind of gross. They're on the sidewalk. And when you're scooter riding through the neighborhood on Halloween to collect candy because scooters may or may not be our super awesome childhood mode of transportation, you squash them. Accidentally, of course, because you like insects overall. Were the ones that survived better adapted? Did they have some special ability to foresee events or to move your scooter away from them? Well, assuming they were all just there on the sidewalk in the path of your trick-or-treating, then no. In this random event example, the survivors were not better adapted. They were lucky. It was chance. And the ones that were squashed were, in this case, at the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's what genetic drift is. Genetic drift can change allele frequencies in a population. Remember, alleles are a form of a gene, but genetic drift is random, unlike natural selection. Recall that in our natural selection video, organisms that have traits that result in high fitness are able to pass those alleles on to their offspring. This is where that survival of the fittest comes into play, but not genetic drift. With genetic drift, the organisms aren't necessarily more fit, they just have won the game of chance. So let's look at a representation of genetic drift known as the bottleneck effect. I always like to remember this one by focusing on the word bottle. Well, let's say that we have a bottle here and we fill it with our Halloween candy. If we shake it out and we only get a few of the candy pieces, does it necessarily represent the whole bottle as far as the candy frequencies you got out? Nope. In fact, one of the types of candy pieces isn't even there. That type is totally eliminated. We'll consider a natural disaster, such as a forest fire. The surviving organisms weren't better adapted. They were likely just in an area where they weren't directly affected. But the survivors don't happen to represent the original population, so there's definitely going to be a new allele frequency among the surviving population. Bottleneck effect. Another time to see genetic drift is when you're talking about the founder effect. In this case, you may have organisms that have founded an island or some new area. The few organisms that arrive to start a new population do not necessarily represent the original population that they came from. Let's take a case where maybe some seeds that are dispersed by wind end up in a new area that happened to be one that was ideal for their growth. This new population grows. Well, those seeds that landed in this new area may not necessarily represent the original population of plants from which they came from. It's a random sample. Founder effect. In summary, genetic drift can make some big changes to allele frequencies, and it's a mechanism for evolution. So one last thing. Which type of population do you think would be more vulnerable to genetic drift? A big population or a small population? If someone is just doing some intense candy hunting and by accident scooter rides over a few insects, look at the results in the small population versus the big population. As you can see, this random event has the potential to cause more change from the original in the small population. See, there weren't as many representatives there in the first place. So in many incidences of genetic drift in populations, the impact on small populations is especially significant. Well, that's it for the Neva Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
Okay, so that was, of course, a perfect introduction into genetic drift. So genetic drift is the effect of chance on a population's gene pool. And, well, what is a gene pool? So gene pool is all the alleles carried by all the individuals in a population. So just recall that genetic drift is a change in the population just due to chance. Okay, so this isn't something that has anything to do with natural selection. It's just due to chance. So here's an example from your textbook. So we have a bunch of bunnies here, and you can see the allele or the genotypes of the bunnies. So we have homozygous recessive is white, and then the heterozygous and homozygous dominants show the brown. Okay. And in the first generation, the allele frequency is equal. So we have equal percentage, 50% have the dominant allele and 50% have the recessive allele. But just due to random chance, okay, in this particular population, these guys were able to reproduce, okay, just due to chance, okay. So it didn't have anything to do with, these guys were ugly or had, something, they smelled bad or they, were weird or, they talked funny or whatever. It was just, something happened and they were not able to reproduce, but these guys happened to reproduce, okay? So based on that, we ended up with this population, okay? So you can see that the allele frequency has now shifted. So now we have, instead of 8 rabbits that are brown and 2 that are white, now we have 9 that are brown and 1 that is white. And then again, out of these 10 bunnies, only 2 of them happen to reproduce, okay? And again, that was just due to chance. Okay, these guys happened to mate. The rest of them, I guess they weren't in the mood, I don't know. And so, and these 2, look at their genotypes. They're homozygous dominant. So now in the 3rd generation, all of them are homozygous dominant. So that was just due to chance, okay? So none of this has to do with natural selection. There was nothing wrong with the white bunnies. There's nothing wrong with, having the recessive allele. It's just due to chance. These 2 bunnies happened to reproduce. None of the others did not. They just didn't reproduce. And so we end up with a population that are all homozygous dominant now. And now we don't even have the recessive allele in the population anymore. It's completely eliminated. Okay, and like the video talked about, genetic drift, it affects small populations. Okay, so this population only had 10 rabbits in it. So if this was a population of 1 million bunnies, then it's not going to show the same effect. Okay, but if it only has 10 rabbits, then you can see just in 3 generations we've completely eliminated this allele, this white color allele, in just 3 generations. So genetic drift can actually cause, it actually lead to less diversity within a population. And it's completely due to random chance. Okay? Let's talk about the bottleneck effect. So the bottleneck effect is where we have the magnification of genetic drift because of some sort of natural event or catastrophe. So the video talked about how, just due to chance, due to like a wildfire or a forest fire, there's, no natural selection or anything like that that's involved, but just, the surviving population was just left due to chance, okay? And so you end up with this bottleneck where a lot of members of the population died off and only the survivors, you're working with that gene pool. And it's due to some sort of natural catastrophe. So like in this case, you can see in the bottle, the red beads, they don't even make it to the next, the surviving population. So they die off, that allele died off just due to chance. Okay, there's been examples of bottleneck effect. We had, for example, with the northern elephant seal off of our Pacific coastline. The northern elephant seal was hunted to near extinction in the late 1800s, to the point where I believe there was about, I think they had like 20 left, just 20, and I think only one of them was male. Because if you know anything about elephant seals, there's like one male that's in charge, and then he's defending off, he has his little harem of females that he defends his territory with. And basically that was it. So there was just maybe 1, maybe 2 males, I can't remember, and then the rest were female. And so, the rest were hunted to extinction. Just hunters had killed them off. And so, And that's an extreme bottleneck. So can you imagine there's just, 20 elephant seals left, and so their gene pool shrunk to just those 20 individuals. And so the surviving population, perhaps just one male and 19 females, that is what the elephant seal population today came from. Okay, so that's a huge bottleneck, just one male. So you can see, that loss of genetic diversity. You basically, all the seals, the elephant seals today came from that, that great single grandfather from many generations ago, back in the late 1800s. Okay, so that's due to some sort of tragic event. Okay, the founder effect, that's due to some sort of like the video alluded to, seeds drifting over and landing on a new spot and establishing a new population. Or it could be something like a human population, or an animal population migrating to a new spot, and that new population happens to have different genetics from the old population, just due to chance. So the textbook talked about a Dutch colony in South Africa that was established. In this particular Dutch colony, there was a higher incidence of Huntington's disease, and I can't remember the other genetic disorder, but that could, that was just due to chance. Just, there's the founding fathers and mothers of that Dutch colony happened to have Huntington's disease in their background, and so since they were the founding fathers and mothers, their population, that gene pool, had a higher rate of that in the gene pool, and so their population has a higher rate of that than back in the Netherlands, where it's a relatively rare disease. Okay, so the founder effect is just, again, due to chance, new populations establishing themselves, that their gene pools look different from the original population. Okay, so that's the third mechanism of evolution, and let's get to the final one, gene flow. So gene flow is the flow of alleles in and out of a population due to the migration of individuals or gametes. So this is a way that we can get new alleles into a population. So you can see here's an example of a population of green beetles, and here's a population of brown beetles, and they're the same species, by the way. So let's say this guy, decides to come over and hang out with these guys. So now we have this brown morph moving in, and so we've added a new variation into this population. So now there is a new allele variation, increasing diversity within this population. Okay, so and then if there's a green beetle that makes his way over here, that increases the diversity of alleles in that population. So you can see how gene flow can actually increase diversity amongst the populations due to the flow of genes, or alleles, I should say. Okay. All right, so those are the four mechanisms. So we talked about natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, and finally gene flow. All right, so let's do some review questions. Galapagos medium ground finches are found on Santa Cruz and San Cristobal Islands, which are separated by about 100 kilometers of ocean. Occasionally, individuals from either island fly to the other islands to stay. This can alter the allele frequencies of the population through which of the following mechanisms? Is it A, natural selection, B, genetic drift, C, gene flow, or D, mutation? So how does it alter the allele frequencies? If you said gene flow, I would agree with you. So basically they're migrating, right? So they're migrating from one island to another. So that's another word for gene flow. Here's another review question. Which of the following pairs do both evolutionary processes introduce new genetic variation into a population? Is it natural selection and genetic drift? B, mutation and gene flow? C, natural selection and gene flow? Or D, gene flow and genetic drift? So which of these introduce new genetic variation? If you said B, mutation and gene flow, I would agree with you. So remember, mutation basically is the source of new alleles, okay, so by the change in the DNA sequence. And then gene flow can also bring in new alleles into the population through migration. Okay, so B is the correct answer. All right, so we are done with 10.2 mechanisms of evolution. So by now you should be able to describe the 4 basic causes of evolution: natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow. You should also be able to explain how each evolutionary force can influence the allele frequencies of a population. Okay, so in our next video we're going to go ahead and take a look at the evidence of evolution in 10.3.